Right now, the world assumes Russia will stay predictable, but one sudden shift could rewrite global power overnight. Fact 1. If Russia suddenly shifted toward full diplomatic de-escalation, the immediate global reaction would be cautious optimism mixed with deep skepticism. The United States and its allies would likely test the sincerity of this change through incremental negotiations rather than full trust. Sanctions relief would not come instantly. It would be phased, conditional, and closely monitored. Markets, however, would react faster than governments. Energy prices could drop within days, stabilizing inflation pressures worldwide. But the biggest shift would be psychological. Decades of strategic hostility don't disappear overnight, and both sides would prepare for the possibility that the change is temporary. Fact 2. A major strategic pivot toward economic cooperation with the West could reshape global trade flows dramatically. Russia's reintegration into financial systems would reopen access to capital, technology, and investment. European industries, especially in energy and manufacturing, could benefit from restored supply chains. However, this would also create tension with countries that adapted to a world without Russia, such as alternative energy exporters. China, in particular, might view this shift as a strategic loss, since Russia's isolation strengthened their partnership. A sudden pivot could weaken that alignment and rebalance global influence in ways that ripple across multiple continents. Fact 3. If Russia redirected its strategy toward internal development instead of external confrontation, the long-term consequences could be significant. Resources currently allocated to military operations could be invested in infrastructure, technology, and domestic stability. This could improve living standards and reduce internal political pressure. However, such a shift would require structural reforms and a level of transparency that might challenge existing power systems. For the outside world, a more stable and economically focused Russia could reduce geopolitical risk, but it would also create a stronger competitor in areas like energy, agriculture, and cybersecurity. Fact 4. A sudden military de-escalation would immediately affect global security calculations, especially in Eastern Europe. NATO countries would reassess troop deployments, defense budgets, and long-term strategy. Some nations might push for reduced military spending, while others would argue for maintaining readiness in case the shift reverses. Ukraine's situation would become the central test of credibility. Any meaningful change in Russia's strategy would need to be visible there first. The outcome could either stabilize the region for decades or create a fragile pause that still carries the risk of future conflict depending on how durable the shift proves to be. Fact 5. If Russia suddenly shifted to full transparency in military doctrine and long-term intentions, it would disrupt decades of strategic ambiguity. The United States relies heavily on intelligence assessments and worst-case planning when dealing with Russia. Removing uncertainty could lower the risk of accidental escalation, especially in high-tension zones like the Baltic region. However, it could also expose weaknesses that adversaries might exploit. Domestically, such openness could increase public pressure within Russia itself. Internationally, trust would grow slowly, but even partial transparency could reshape how global powers calculate risk. Fact 6. A rapid shift toward energy cooperation with Western nations could immediately impact American households. Lower global oil and gas prices would reduce inflation pressure, something voters in the United States feel directly at the pump and in utility bills. However, this would come with trade-offs. US. Energy producers, especially in shale, could face reduced competitiveness, potentially affecting jobs in key states. Politically, this would spark intense debate. Cheaper energy versus domestic production security. The question would divide policymakers, businesses, and voters, creating exactly the kind of argument that dominates elections. Fact 7. If Russia reoriented its strategy towards strengthening alliances with Western institutions instead of opposing them, global power structures would shift significantly. Organizations like NATO and the European Union would face a dilemma: integrate cautiously or maintain distance. For the United States, this could reduce long-term military commitments abroad, but it might also weaken the justification for existing defense budgets. At the same time, countries that relied on Russia as a counterbalance to the West could feel exposed. This shift would not create immediate unity. It would create a new kind of tension over how much trust is actually possible. Fact 8. A sudden change in Russia's cyber strategy, from offensive operations to strict restraint, would reshape one of the most invisible battlefields. The United States has long treated cyber threats as a constant background risk, affecting infrastructure, elections, and private companies. If those threats decreased, it could reduce billions in cybersecurity spending over time. However, skepticism would remain high. American agencies would likely assume the capability still exists, even if unused. The real impact would be psychological, a rare moment where a major threat appears to step back, forcing policymakers to decide whether to believe it or prepare for its return. Fact 9. If Russia suddenly committed to long-term arms reduction beyond existing treaties, it would directly impact US national security planning. American defense strategy is built around maintaining balance with peer competitors. A verified reduction in nuclear or conventional capabilities could lower the immediate threat level, but it would also create internal debate in the United States. Some would argue for reducing defense spending, while others would warn against lowering guard too quickly. The risk is asymmetry. If reductions are uneven or reversible, the United States could find itself strategically exposed within a very short time frame. Fact 10. A shift toward open economic data and financial transparency in Russia would immediately affect global investors. American companies and funds that previously avoided Russian markets due to uncertainty might reconsider. This could unlock new investment opportunities, especially in natural resources and infrastructure. However, the memory of past instability would not disappear. Investors would demand strong guarantees and legal protections before committing capital. The US government would also face pressure to define clear rules for engagement, balancing economic opportunity with national security concerns, particularly in sectors tied to critical technologies. Fact 11. If Russia redirected its foreign policy toward conflict resolution in multiple regions, it could change how the United States approaches global leadership. In areas like the Middle East or parts of Africa, Russia has historically played a disruptive or competitive role. A cooperative shift could reduce proxy tensions and open the door for joint diplomatic efforts. However, this would also challenge the current US role as the primary global mediator. Sharing influence is not a simple adjustment. It could lead to friction within alliances as partners question how power and responsibility should be divided. Fact 12. A sudden internal political reform in Russia, focused on institutional accountability and rule of law, would have long-term geopolitical consequences. For the United States, this would complicate the narrative that has shaped foreign policy for years. A more predictable and legally consistent Russia could become a more legitimate global actor, making it harder to justify certain sanctions or containment strategies. At the same time, this could increase competition in international institutions. The shift would not eliminate rivalry. It would transform it into a more structured and less confrontational form of competition. Fact 13. If Russia changed its strategy to prioritize global image and soft power, the effects would be subtle but powerful. Instead of relying on military or energy leverage, it could invest in media, culture, and international partnerships. For American audiences, this would create a new kind of influence challenge, one that operates through perception rather than force. Competing narratives could shape public opinion in ways that are harder to counter directly. The United States would need to respond not with confrontation, but with its own soft power strategy, making this a quieter but deeply influential form of global competition. Fact 14. If Russia suddenly aligned its strategy with global climate initiatives, it would reshape energy politics almost immediately. As one of the largest fossil fuel exporters, any pivot toward renewables or emissions reduction would affect global supply and pricing. For the United States, this could accelerate the transition to clean energy, while also creating economic pressure in traditional energy sectors. However, skepticism would remain about long-term commitment. If the shift proved consistent, it could reduce one of the biggest global risks, resource-driven conflict, while opening a new arena of competition in green technology leadership. Fact 15. A strategic shift towards stabilizing neighboring regions instead of influencing them could significantly reduce refugee flows and regional instability. For the United States, this would mean fewer humanitarian crises requiring intervention or financial support. However, it would also change the balance of influence in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Countries that previously relied on US support might begin recalibrating their alliances. This could reduce immediate tension but also gradually limit American influence in regions where stability is no longer tied to US presence. Fact 16. If Russia restructured its military posture to focus purely on territorial defense, it would alter global threat perception. The United States has long planned for power projection scenarios involving Russia. Removing that element would lower the perceived risk of direct confrontation. However, defense planners in the US would likely remain cautious, maintaining readiness due to the possibility of a rapid reversal. This shift could create a paradox: reduced visible threat but sustained underlying mistrust, leading to a slower, more cautious adjustment in military doctrine rather than immediate change. Fact 17. A sudden shift toward full participation in global institutions and compliance with international norms would redefine Russia's role on the world stage. For the United States, this would present both opportunity and challenge. Cooperation on global issues like nuclear security or counterterrorism could improve outcomes. At the same time, Russia would gain greater legitimacy and influence within those same institutions. This could dilute US dominance in decision-making processes, forcing a transition from leading unilaterally to negotiating more frequently within shared frameworks. Fact 18. If Russia redirected its strategy toward long-term partnership with the United States, the psychological impact alone would be profound. Generations of Americans have grown up viewing Russia as a primary adversary. A genuine shift would force a re-evaluation of that mindset, not just in government, but in media and public opinion. However, trust would be the central obstacle. Even with consistent actions, many would question whether the change is permanent. The result would be a divided response, some pushing for cooperation, others insisting on caution, creating a national debate that could shape US policy for years. Fact 19. If Russia shifted toward full cooperation in global intelligence sharing, especially on terrorism and organized crime, it could significantly strengthen international security. For the United States, this would mean access to regions and networks that are currently difficult to monitor. Joint operations could become more effective, potentially preventing attacks before they happen. However, this level of cooperation would raise serious concerns about data security and trust. Sharing sensitive intelligence requires confidence that it will not be misused. The US would face a difficult balance between improving security outcomes and protecting its own intelligence infrastructure. Fact 20. A sudden pivot toward reducing influence in global disinformation campaigns would change the information landscape dramatically. The United States has spent years addressing concerns about foreign interference in media and elections. If that pressure decreased, it could restore some level of confidence in digital platforms. However, the absence of one major actor does not eliminate the problem entirely. Other states or non-state groups could fill the gap. For American society, the challenge would shift from reacting to a known source to managing a more fragmented and unpredictable information environment. Fact 21. If Russia restructured its economy to integrate more deeply with global supply chains, it could alter manufacturing and trade patterns that Americans rely on daily. Certain industries in the United States might benefit from lower costs and expanded partnerships. At the same time, increased competition could pressure domestic producers, especially in sectors sensitive to price changes. Politically, this would become a debate about globalization versus economic security. The benefits of integration would be clear, but so would the risks of dependence on a country whose long-term strategic direction remains uncertain. Fact 22. A shift towards strict adherence to international law in military and diplomatic actions would influence how conflicts are managed worldwide. For the United States, this could create opportunities for more predictable negotiations and fewer sudden escalations. However, it would also raise expectations for consistency across all global actors, including the US itself. This could lead to increased scrutiny of American actions on the international stage. The result would not just be a change in Russia's behavior, but a broader shift toward accountability that affects every major power. Fact 23. If Russia prioritized rebuilding trust with European nations, the strategic relationship between the United States and Europe could evolve. A more stable Europe might require less direct American military presence, allowing the US to redirect resources elsewhere. However, this could also reduce American influence in European decision-making over time. The transatlantic alliance has been shaped by shared security concerns, If those concerns diminish, the nature of that alliance would inevitably change, raising questions about long-term priorities and commitments. Fact 24. If Russia adopted a strategy focused on long-term economic predictability and rule-based engagement, global markets would respond with increased stability. For American investors and businesses, this could open new opportunities while reducing volatility tied to geopolitical risk. However, predictability also strengthens competitors. A more stable and economically integrated Russia could become a stronger player in key sectors like energy, agriculture, and raw materials. This would force the United States to compete more directly, shifting the relationship from confrontation to economic rivalry. Less dangerous, but still deeply consequential. Fact 25. If Russia shifted toward long-term cooperation in Arctic development, it would directly affect US strategic interests. The Arctic is becoming increasingly important due to shipping routes and natural resources. A cooperative approach could reduce the risk of militarization in the region and open joint economic opportunities. However, it would also intensify competition over influence and access. The United States would need to decide whether to partner in development or counterbalance Russia's geographic advantage. This is not a distant issue. It impacts future trade routes, energy access, and global logistics. Fact 26. A sudden shift toward limiting arms exports to conflict regions could reduce violence in multiple parts of the world. For the United States, this might lower the intensity of certain conflicts where Russian weapons have been present. However, it could also shift demand toward other suppliers, including American defense companies. This creates a complex situation where reduced global conflict is beneficial, but economic interests tied to defense exports could be affected. The debate would become moral versus strategic, something that resonates strongly with American public opinion. Fact 27. If Russia focused on stabilizing global food supply chains, particularly in grain exports, it would have immediate global impact. Russia is a major agricultural exporter, and disruptions have historically affected global food prices. A stable and cooperative approach could reduce food insecurity in vulnerable regions. For the United States, this could lower pressure on humanitarian aid budgets. However, it could also increase competition for American farmers in international markets. The result would be lower global risk, but higher economic competition in one of the most politically sensitive industries in the US. Fact 28. A shift towards strict non-interference in other nations' domestic politics would change how the United States approaches election security. For years, concerns about foreign influence have shaped policies and public discourse. If that threat visibly decreased, it could restore some confidence in democratic systems. However, skepticism would remain deeply rooted. American institutions would continue preparing for interference even in its absence. The deeper impact would be psychological, forcing the public to question whether reduced interference is real or simply less visible. Fact 29. If Russia redirected its strategy toward technological collaboration instead of competition, it could reshape innovation ecosystems. Joint research in areas like space, medicine, and energy could accelerate breakthroughs that benefit both countries. For the United States, this presents both opportunity and risk. Collaboration can drive progress, but it also raises concerns about intellectual property and national security. The balance between sharing knowledge and protecting strategic advantage would become a central issue, especially in technologies with both civilian and military applications. Fact 30. If Russia committed to a long-term strategy of predictable rules-based engagement with the United States, the biggest change might not be military or economic, it would be strategic mindset. American policy for decades has been built around managing uncertainty with Russia. Removing that uncertainty would force a complete recalibration. Some would see it as an opportunity to reduce tensions and costs. Others would argue that predictability can be reversed at any moment. The result would not be consensus. It would be a deeply divided national conversation about whether to trust stability or prepare for its collapse. Fact 31. If Russia shifted toward fully predictable nuclear doctrine with strict no-first-use commitments and verifiable safeguards, it would directly impact American strategic anxiety. For decades, uncertainty around escalation has shaped US defense planning and public fear. A credible shift could lower the perceived risk of catastrophic conflict. However, verification would be the central issue. The United States would demand transparency that is difficult to guarantee completely. Even a small doubt would keep deterrent strategies in place. The result would be reduced tension on the surface, but continued caution beneath it. Fact 32. A sudden pivot toward prioritizing civilian technological growth, such as artificial intelligence, infrastructure, and digital systems, could turn Russia into a more direct economic competitor to the United States. This would shift rivalry away from military confrontation into innovation and productivity. For Americans, this could mean faster global technological progress, but also increased pressure on US industries to remain competitive. The concern would not be immediate conflict, but long-term positioning. Economic competition tends to be quieter, but it shapes global influence just as deeply as military power. Fact 33. If Russia adopted a strategy of long-term consistency in foreign policy decisions, it would challenge one of the core assumptions in US strategy, that unpredictability is a constant factor. American policymakers often plan for sudden shifts and worst-case scenarios. Removing that variable would require a complete adjustment in how risk is calculated. However, consistency itself would be tested over time. One unexpected move could erase years of trust. For the American public, this would create ongoing debate. Is stability real, or is it simply a pause before another shift? Fact 34. A shift toward reducing military presence near NATO borders would have immediate symbolic and strategic consequences. For the United States, this could lower the urgency of forward deployments and reduce the risk of accidental confrontation. However, it would also raise questions about long-term commitments to allies. Some European nations might feel safer, while others might worry that reduced tension leads to reduced support. This creates a complex dynamic where decreased threat does not automatically lead to increased confidence, especially in regions with long memories of past conflicts. Fact 35. If Russia committed to a generational strategy focused on stability, cooperation, and gradual integration into the global system, the biggest impact would unfold over decades, not years. For the United States, this would redefine what competition looks like, not as a constant threat, but as a long-term comparison of systems, values, and outcomes. The danger would not be sudden conflict, but gradual shifts in influence. Americans would be forced to ask a difficult question. Is long-term stability with a competitor more challenging than short-term confrontation with an adversary? If this shift happened tomorrow, would America trust it or prepare for something worse?